the first thing the HOA president said to me was that the lake behind my house didn't belong to me anymore. I was still holding a half-empty coffee mug when the sound of tires crunching over gravel rolled down my driveway like distant thunder. 3 white golf carts came around the bend, slow and deliberate, the way people drive when they think they already own the place. I had moved in less than 24 hours earlier. Boxes were still stacked in my living room, the air inside the house smelling like cardboard and fresh paint, and the morning fog was just lifting off the water behind my backyard. The lake looked calm, perfectly still, reflecting the pale Texas sky like a sheet of glass. I remember thinking that this was exactly why I bought the place. Quiet. Private. Mine. The cart stopped beside the wooden path that led down to the dock. Doors didn't slam. Nobody rushed. They stepped out like a committee arriving to inspect a problem. The woman leading them wore a bright blue blazer, even though it was already pushing 80 degrees. Perfect blonde hair, sunglasses large enough to hide half her face. She carried a leather folder under one arm and walked toward me with the calm confidence of someone used to giving orders. "You must be the new owner," she said. Her voice had that practiced sweetness that somehow sounded more like a warning than a greeting. "I'm Diane Whitmore, president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association." Behind her stood 4 residents I had never seen before, arms crossed, all staring past me toward the water like they were already picturing their boats out there. Diane didn't ask if she could step onto the property. She already had. Her heels tapped across the wooden boards of the dock walkway, sharp little clicks echoing over the lake. She opened the leather folder and slid out a sheet of paper. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding about this property," she continued, holding the document like it was a winning hand in a card game. "The lake access here belongs to the entire community." The breeze shifted then, carrying the smell of fresh water and cedar from the shoreline. I looked past them toward the water. About 100 yards out, I could see 2 pontoon boats floating near the far bank, both tied to long rows of wooden docks that stretched from the neighborhood across the cove. Dozens of empty slips waited there like parking spaces. Diane followed my gaze and smiled as if she had already won the argument. "Our residents have been using this lake for years," she said. "Your dock just happens to sit on the main access point." The word just hung in the air like it was supposed to make everything simple. One of the men behind her adjusted his sunglasses and nodded toward the boats like he was already imagining the weekend. Diane tapped the paper with one manicured finger. "So we'll need you to keep this path open," she said. "The HOA controls lake usage here." I set my coffee mug down on the railing and watched the ripples moving slowly across the water. The lake was quiet again. Calm. Peaceful. Exactly the way it had looked when I signed the closing papers 2 weeks earlier. What Diane Whitmore didn't realize standing there on my dock that morning was that every single boat in that neighborhood depended on the one structure sitting directly under her feet. And that structure didn't belong to the HOA. It belonged to me. My name is Ethan Carter, and I did not buy this place for the HOA meetings. I bought it because of the lake. 2 months earlier, I had been standing on this exact dock during the final property walkthrough, listening to the slow creak of the boards under my boots and the steady slap of water against the posts. The realtor had talked about square footage and resale value, but I barely heard a word she said. All I could see was the stretch of open water spreading across nearly 60 acres of quiet Texas hill country. The lake curved through the land like a silver ribbon, bordered by cedar trees and limestone bluffs that turned golden in the evening sun. A place like that does something to a person. It makes the noise of cities feel very far away. I had spent 15 years working as a civil engineer designing water management systems for reservoirs and flood control projects across the state, which meant I had spent most of my career studying lakes that belonged to somebody else. For once I wanted a small piece of water that belonged to me. The house itself was nothing fancy, a single story. Limestone place built sometime in the early 1970s. The previous owner had been an old rancher named Thomas Carter, no relation to me, but a man who apparently cared about 2 things in life: fishing and privacy. He built the dock by hand nearly 40 years ago. Thick cedar posts driven deep into the lake bed, wide planks weathered smooth by decades of sun and rain. When I first stepped onto it during the inspection, the boards groaned like an old porch swing, but the structure itself was solid as bedrock. The survey map from closing day showed the property line extending all the way down the slope, across the shoreline, and out through the dock itself. That detail stuck in my head because engineers notice details the way mechanics notice engine sounds. The dock was not just decoration. It was positioned exactly where the narrow channel opened into the wider part of the lake. Anyone launching a boat from the residential side of the cove would naturally pass through that point. At the time, I assumed that was just convenient placement. Now, standing there with Diane Whitmore and her small committee staring at me like a jury that had already made up its mind, I realized something else was going on in this neighborhood. Diane spoke again, her tone patient in the way people sound when they think they are explaining something obvious. She told me that Willow Creek Estates had always treated the lake as shared community water. She explained that families had fished there for years, children learned to paddle small kayaks there, and residents stored their boats along the long row of slips on the opposite shore. As she talked, one of the men behind her pointed toward the far docks and said that nearly every household on their side owned some kind of boat. Pontoon boats, bass boats, small aluminum fishing rigs. Diane nodded proudly, like she was describing a beloved neighborhood tradition. But what caught my attention was not the tradition. It was the direction every one of those docks faced. They all opened toward the same narrow channel. Toward this dock. Toward the piece of shoreline now sitting inside my property line. Diane closed her folder with a quiet snap and looked around like she expected me to apologize for the confusion. The breeze pushed a ripple across the lake in the morning. Sun climbed a little higher over the cedar trees. I rested my hands on the dock railing and studied the water again, the way an engineer studies a map. Because the more I looked at that channel, the more I began to understand that this lake was not just a scenic backyard feature. It was a system, and every system has one point where everything depends on a single piece of ground. The silence on the dock stretched for a few seconds after Diane finished explaining how things worked around Willow Creek Estates. The breeze carried the soft rattle of halyards from the boats across the cove, and somewhere down the shoreline a heron lifted off the water with a slow, heavy flap of wings. Diane stood there with her folder tucked under one arm, like a judge waiting for a verdict that had already been decided. The other residents watched me carefully, the way neighbors do when they are trying to figure out whether the new guy will cause trouble or quietly fall in line. I had seen the same dynamic on construction sites and city planning meetings for years. People get used to a system, and after a while they forget where the rules actually came from. Diane tilted her head slightly and gave a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She said that the community had maintained access to the lake long before I arrived, and that previous owners had always understood the arrangement. According to her, the dock was simply a convenient pathway for residents to reach open water. One of the men behind her added that his family had been launching their fishing boat there every summer for nearly a decade. Another woman mentioned that children from the neighborhood liked to paddle small kayaks through the channel in the evenings when the water was calm. Diane nodded at each comment like a conductor guiding a quiet orchestra of agreement. Then she placed the document from her folder onto the railing beside my coffee mug. The paper fluttered slightly in the warm breeze. She explained that the Homeowners Association had prepared a standard access agreement for lakefront properties along this side of the cove. The language was simple, she said. I would allow unrestricted use of the dock walkway and shoreline path for residents of Willow Creek Estates. In return, the community would continue to maintain what she called the shared recreational environment of the lake. She spoke slowly, calmly, as if she expected the conversation to end right there with a handshake and a neighborly smile. I leaned against the railing and looked again toward the far bank where the long wooden docks stretched out from the neighborhood, like fingers reaching toward the center of the water. Sunlight glinted off metal boat rails and polished outboard motors. A few empty slips rocked gently against their bumpers, waiting for the weekend crowd that Diane had described. I counted at least 15 boats from where I stood, and more slips extended beyond the bend in the shoreline. That was a lot of water traffic for one narrow exit channel. Diane must have noticed where my attention had gone because she followed my gaze again and said that the community took great pride in keeping the lake active and friendly. She used the word community several times in that sentence. The others nodded again, their confidence growing with every quiet moment that passed. Finally, Diane slid the paper a few inches closer to me and offered a pen from her folder. The polished silver clip caught the sunlight for a second before she held it out. Her expression was patient, certain, the expression of someone who had delivered this same speech many times before to people who eventually agreed. The lake breeze shifted again and brushed across the dock, carrying the faint smell of cedar and warm water. I picked up the document and read the first few lines slowly while the group waited. The language sounded official enough, but something about it felt strangely incomplete. Maybe it was the engineer in me, but I had spent too many years reading diagrams and permits to ignore missing pieces in a system. I lowered the paper and looked back toward the channel between the two limestone points that formed the only natural path between the neighborhood docks and the open water. The more I studied that gap, the more one simple question kept forming in my mind. If everyone on that side of the lake depended on this narrow passage to reach the water, then who exactly controlled the ground beneath the dock that sat right in the middle of it? The pen Diane Whitmore offered hovered in the air between us for a moment, shining. In the morning sun, like the final step in a transaction she believed was already finished. I could hear the gentle creak of the dock ropes across the water and the distant hum of a boat motor somewhere far down the lake. But here on the dock, everything felt strangely quiet. The residents behind her waited with polite smiles, the kind people wear when they expect cooperation. Diane's expression remained calm and certain, the confidence of someone who had repeated the same explanation many times and had never once been told no. I lowered the document slowly and placed it back on the railing beside my coffee mug. The paper rustled softly in the breeze. Diane noticed the movement and lifted one eyebrow slightly. She asked if there was any confusion about the agreement. Her tone remained friendly but carried the faint edge of impatience that appears when someone assumes the delay is simply a matter of paperwork. I told her that I understood what the document said. She nodded as if that confirmed everything. One of the men behind her crossed his arms and glanced toward the far side of the cove where the long line of neighborhood docks stretched into the water. The sunlight reflected off the lake in bright shifting patterns that danced along the boards beneath our feet. Diane said the agreement was only a formality because the previous owners had always allowed the community to pass through the dock area. She explained that Willow Creek Estates had maintained that access for years without problems, and that cooperation kept the neighborhood peaceful. She spoke about tradition again, about shared enjoyment of the lake, about how everyone in the community respected the water and the property around it. As she talked, she gestured toward the narrow channel that ran between the limestone edges of the shoreline, the same channel I had been studying since they arrived. The water there was slightly darker where the lake deepened before opening into the wider section beyond. Diane explained that this pathway had always been the natural route for boats leaving the neighborhood slips. According to her, the arrangement simply allowed residents to continue using the lake the way they always had. She stepped a little closer to the railing and pointed toward the docks across the cove again. From this angle, I could see at least 20 empty slips waiting for boats that would likely arrive by the weekend. The wooden frames rocked gently with the small movement of the water. A few faded bumpers tapped softly against the posts with slow, steady rhythm. Diane followed my gaze and smiled again. She said the lake was one of the main reasons people chose to live in Willow Creek Estates. Families fished there, neighbors gathered there, and summer afternoons often ended with small boats drifting across the water while the sun dropped behind the cedar hills. Her voice carried a sense of pride, as if the lake itself belonged to the neighborhood she represented. The others nodded again. Their confidence seemed to grow with every word she spoke. I rested my hands on the weathered railing of the dock and looked once more at the water moving through the narrow channel beside us. The breeze brushed across the surface, creating small ripples that moved outward toward the wider lake. For a long moment, I said nothing at all. Diane eventually cleared her throat gently and tapped the paper again, reminding me that the agreement only needed a signature. The silver pen appeared in her hand once more. I accepted the pen this time, but instead of signing the document, I simply turned it slowly between my fingers and glanced back at the water. Because the more I studied that narrow stretch of lake beside the dock, the more one detail became impossible to ignore. Every single boat sitting at those neighborhood docks would eventually pass through this exact spot if it wanted to reach open water. And that meant the entire community depended on a pathway that crossed directly through the piece of property they had just tried to claim did not belong to me. The silver pen rolled slowly between my fingers while Diane Whitmore waited with the quiet confidence of someone who believed the conversation was already finished. The residents behind her shifted their weight on the dock boards, the wood creaking softly under their shoes. One of them glanced at his watch while another looked across the cove where the long row of neighborhood docks stretched into the lake like a wooden spine. A breeze drifted across the water, carrying the warm scent of cedar trees and sunlit limestone. I looked down at the paper again, reading the lines carefully this time. The agreement was written in simple language, almost too simple. It talked about unrestricted community access, shared lake usage, and continued cooperation between property owners and the homeowners association. It sounded polite, neighborly, and completely one-sided. Diane watched my eyes move across the page and gave a small approving nod as if she believed I was finally recognizing the obvious solution. She explained again that the agreement only preserved what had always existed. According to her, every previous owner of this property understood the arrangement and allowed the residents of Willow Creek Estates to pass through the dock area whenever they needed to reach the open water. One of the men behind her spoke up and said the neighborhood had built their docks years ago with the understanding that the channel here would always remain open. Another resident added that families had been fishing in this lake since before the houses on the hill were even finished. Diane listened to each comment with the satisfied expression of someone who had assembled the perfect supporting argument. She told me that the community valued respect and cooperation above everything else. The lake, she said, was part of the neighborhood's identity. She described summer evenings with neighbors drifting across the water in small boats while children laughed from the docks. The way she spoke made the entire arrangement sound less like a legal demand and more like a cherished local tradition that I had somehow wandered into by accident. I lowered the document again and rested it against the railing beside the mug that still held the last inch of cooling coffee. The surface of the lake shimmered under the rising Texas sun, bright reflections moving across the channel beside the dock. I studied the water for a moment while the group waited. The narrow passage between the limestone edges was no more than 30 feet wide in some places. From an engineering perspective, it was the perfect natural choke point, the kind of place where water traffic naturally converged before spreading back out into the open lake. Diane must have noticed where my attention had settled because she stepped slightly closer and followed my gaze again. She said that everyone who lived in Willow Creek Estates used that channel to reach the deeper water on the other side of the cove. Her voice carried the same calm certainty it had from the beginning of the conversation. She told me that allowing access was simply the neighborly thing to do. I nodded slowly while turning the pen in my hand again. For a moment I considered the scene exactly as she had described it. Boats leaving the slips along the far bank, engines humming gently across the water, families heading out toward the open lake. It was easy to imagine the routine repeating weekend after weekend. But systems like that only work when one small detail stays invisible. The dock boards creaked under my boots as I shifted my weight and looked again toward the channel where the water flowed quietly past the end of the walkway. Because the more I thought about Diane's description of how the neighborhood used the lake, the more one simple fact kept coming back to me. Every single boat on those docks depended on this narrow strip of water to reach the open lake. And that strip of water passed directly through the piece of land that sat beneath my dock. The quiet on the dock grew heavier the longer I held the pen without signing anything. Diane Whitmore shifted slightly beside the railing, her polished shoes tapping once against the cedar boards as if patience itself had a sound. The other residents watched carefully, their earlier confidence still there, but beginning to soften around the edges. People get uncomfortable when a simple conversation takes longer than expected. I placed the pen gently on top of the document and looked across the water again, letting the moment stretch out just a little longer. The lake moved slowly in the sunlight, small waves sliding through the narrow channel beside the dock before spreading out into the wider cove beyond. It was a peaceful place, but the longer I studied the layout of the shoreline, the more the engineer inside my head started organizing the entire scene like a diagram. Years of working on water systems had trained me to see patterns most people ignored. Rivers, spillways, floodgates, access channels. Every one of them depended on specific points where flow passed from one space into another. And those points always mattered more than the water around them. Diane finally cleared her throat lightly and asked if there was any problem with the agreement. Her voice remained friendly, but the tone carried a hint of curiosity now. I told her there was no problem with understanding the document. The language was clear. What interested me was something the paper did not mention. She tilted her head slightly and waited for me to explain. Instead, I turned and looked back toward the far shoreline where the neighborhood docks stretched along the waterline. The sunlight reflected off metal rails and polished boat hulls. Even from this distance, I could see at least a dozen slips ready for boats that would likely arrive by the weekend. Diane followed my gaze once again and said that most residents kept their boats ready throughout the summer. Fishing boats, pontoons, small pleasure craft. Families liked to head out onto the lake in the evenings after the heat faded. She said the neighborhood took pride in keeping the lake active and welcoming. Her voice carried the same calm certainty she had used from the beginning, but this time I noticed something else in the way she spoke. She assumed the system had always worked exactly the way she described it. That assumption made sense if nobody had ever stopped to examine the original property boundaries. I reached into my back pocket then and pulled out the folded survey map the realtor had given me during closing. The paper was slightly creased from being carried around since move-in day. Diane watched with mild curiosity while I opened it across the railing beside the agreement. The survey lines were simple black ink across pale paper, showing the boundaries of the property exactly as they had been recorded decades earlier. I traced one finger slowly along the line that followed the slope of the shoreline and continued out along the wooden shape representing the dock itself. Diane leaned forward slightly to see what I was looking at. The others stepped closer as well, their earlier patience replaced by quiet interest. I did not say anything right away. Instead, I simply tapped the narrow point where the dock extended directly across the channel they had been describing all morning. Because once the map was laid out in plain sight, the arrangement of the entire lake suddenly became much easier to understand. Every boat on those neighborhood docks had only one practical route to reach the open water, and that route crossed a structure that stood entirely inside the property line printed on the paper resting under my hand. The survey map rested flat against the railing while the breeze lifted one corner of the paper. Diane Whitmore leaned closer, her sunglasses sliding slightly down the bridge of her nose as she tried to understand what I was pointing at. The other residents gathered around as well, their shadows stretching across the dock boards in the late morning sun. From this angle the map was simple to read. The shoreline curved along the edge of the property, the boundary line following the slope of the hill before extending out across the wooden outline that represented the dock. The ink line continued past the end of the walkway and stopped just short of the darker section of water where the channel opened into the lake. I tapped the paper again gently, right where the dock crossed the narrowest part of the channel. Diane studied the map for several seconds without saying anything. One of the men beside her squinted down at the survey lines and then glanced back across the lake toward the neighborhood docks. The quiet creak of rope against wood echoed from somewhere behind us. A small breeze pushed a ripple through the water below, and the lake reflected shifting patterns of sunlight onto the underside of the dock planks. Finally, Diane straightened up slightly and folded her arms, her earlier confidence beginning to return to her voice. She said that the survey might show the property line under the dock, but that did not change the fact that the Homeowners Association had always used the channel for lake access. According to her, long-standing community use carried just as much importance as the printed lines on an old piece of paper. The others nodded quickly as if the explanation settled everything again. One woman pointed toward the far shoreline and reminded everyone that dozens of families in Willow Creek estates had built their docks with the understanding that the lake remained open to the neighborhood. Diane added that access to the lake had never been questioned before, and that cooperation between neighbors was the foundation of the community. I listened quietly while she spoke, letting the words settle into the still air above the water. The lake breeze shifted again, brushing across the map and making the paper rustle softly under my hand. When Diane finished, I looked back across the cove toward the long row of slips stretching out from the neighborhood shore. A few empty bumpers tapped against the wooden posts with a slow, hollow rhythm. The scene was peaceful, almost quiet enough to make the conversation feel unnecessary. But systems like the one Diane described only work when everyone assumes the structure underneath them will never change. I folded the survey map carefully and slid it back into my pocket. Diane watched the movement with a patient expression that suggested she believed the discussion had reached its natural conclusion. She said that once the agreement was signed, the neighborhood would continue using the lake exactly the way it always had. The silver pen appeared in her hand again. She held it out with the same confident smile from earlier, waiting for the simple formality to be completed. I looked at the pen, then at the narrow strip of water running beside the dock, where the channel carried every boat from the neighborhood toward the open lake. The breeze moved slowly across the surface, small ripples sliding through the passage before spreading outward across the wider water beyond. After a moment, I rested my hands on the railing and looked back at Diane. Because the more everyone talked about tradition and shared use of the lake, the clearer one simple fact became in my mind. Traditions only continue when the person who controls the path decides to keep it open. The silver pin remained in Diane Whitmore's hand, suspended between us like the final move in a conversation she believed was already finished. The lake breeze drifted through the cedar trees behind the house, carrying the warm smell of sunlit water and dry limestone. For a long moment nobody spoke. The only sound was the quiet tapping of boat bumpers across the cove, where the neighborhood docks stretched into the lake. Diane cleared her throat gently, the polite signal that patience was starting to wear thin. She reminded me that the agreement simply preserved the way things had always worked in Willow Creek Estates. The residents behind her nodded again, though their earlier confidence had softened into cautious curiosity. I looked from the pen to the narrow strip of water running beside the dock, and then back toward the far shoreline, where the empty slips waited for boats that would arrive by the weekend. From where we stood it was easy to see the entire path every boat would take. They would leave their docks along the neighborhood shoreline, idle slowly across the cove, and pass through the same narrow channel beside my property before reaching the deeper water beyond the limestone points. The system worked beautifully as long as that channel remained open. I rested my hands on the weathered railing and let my eyes follow the path across the lake one more time. The sunlight shimmered across the water like scattered glass. Diane noticed where I was looking and repeated that the channel had always been used for community access. She spoke the words carefully now, as if reinforcing a rule that had never needed to be questioned before. I nodded slowly and finally picked up the pen from her hand. A few of the residents relaxed immediately, their shoulders easing as if the moment of uncertainty had finally passed. Diane watched with a small, satisfied smile, confident that the agreement was about to be signed. Instead, I placed the pen gently on top of the paper and slid the document back across the railing toward her. The breeze lifted the corner again, and the paper rustled softly in the warm air. Diane blinked once, surprised, and looked up at me. I told her that the lake itself was not the problem. Water belonged to everyone who respected it. The real issue was the structure sitting directly under our feet. I gestured toward the dock boards stretching out across the narrow channel. The wood creaked quietly as the breeze pushed against the posts below. Diane glanced down at the planks and then back toward the neighborhood docks across the cove, her expression slowly shifting as the implication began to settle in. I explained calmly that every boat leaving those docks needed to pass through the channel that ran beside this structure. The path they depended on crossed the exact spot where my property line extended into the water. The residents exchanged uncertain looks with one another. The man who had mentioned fishing earlier turned and studied the channel again with a thoughtful expression. Diane said that the community had always used the lake that way. Her voice sounded a little less certain now. I nodded again and leaned lightly against the railing while the breeze carried another set of ripples through the channel beside us. Traditions can last a very long time when nobody questions the foundation beneath them. But foundations still matter. Because in a system like this one, the lake might belong to the horizon, the sky, and every person who sails across it. The path to reach that water, however, is controlled by whoever owns the ground directly underneath it. For a moment nobody spoke. The breeze slid quietly across the lake, and the water moved through the narrow channel beside the dock with the same slow rhythm it had probably followed for decades. Diane Whitmore looked down at the dock boards under her feet, and then back across the cove where the long line of neighborhood slips stretched along the opposite shoreline. The residents who had arrived with her slowly turned to follow the same view, their earlier confidence replaced by the kind of quiet calculation people make when they realize a situation is not as simple as they thought. Diane folded the agreement paper carefully and slid it back into her leather folder without saying anything. The silver pen disappeared beside it. Her expression had changed now. The calm certainty from earlier had softened into something more cautious. She asked, in a voice that sounded much more measured, whether I was suggesting that the channel access depended entirely on the dock structure. I rested my hands on the railing and looked out across the water again before answering. The sunlight had climbed higher above the cedar hills, and the lake's surface shimmered with long streaks of light. I explained that water itself could not be owned in the way land could. Lakes had always belonged to the sky and the shoreline and the people who respected them. But the physical structures built along that water followed different rules. The dock beneath our feet stood entirely inside the property boundary shown on the county survey. The channel they used to reach the open lake passed directly through that same boundary. From an engineering perspective, it was simply a narrow point in a larger system. Whoever controlled the structure at that point controlled the pathway that boats used to move through it. One of the men behind Diane slowly looked back toward the slips across the cove, as if seeing the arrangement for the first time. Another resident quietly whistled under his breath while studying the water beside the dock. Diane remained still for a moment longer before finally nodding once. She said the community had always assumed the channel remained open because every previous owner allowed it. I nodded in return. That part was probably true. The rancher who built the dock decades earlier likely never imagined that the simple path across his shoreline would become the only route for an entire neighborhood to reach the lake. Traditions sometimes begin that way. A small convenience slowly grows into an expectation. Diane closed the leather folder and rested it under her arm again. The breeze lifted a few strands of her hair as she glanced across the lake once more. Her voice was much quieter now when she spoke again. She said that the Homeowners Association might need to review the original access agreements before asking any new property owner to sign something similar. I told her that sounded like a reasonable place to start. The residents began drifting back toward their golf carts one by one, their earlier enthusiasm replaced by thoughtful silence. Diane lingered for a final moment at the edge of the dock before turning to leave. The lake returned to its peaceful rhythm as the sound of tires slowly faded up the gravel driveway. I remained standing there long after they were gone, watching the ripples move through the narrow channel beside the dock. The water kept flowing exactly the same way it always had. The only difference was that now everyone understood one simple truth about the system surrounding that lake. The water belonged to the horizon, but the path that reached it depended on the ground beneath my feet.